Hi everyone, welcome to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 28th, where I wanted to put some closure onto Frankenstein. And you can see in the notes below that we will be moving forward to Edgar Allan Poe. So for those of you who don't necessarily have access to a hard copy of Poe, I was able to find the short stories that we will be reading online. You can see the links in the notes below for The Fall of the House of Usher, The Mask of Red Death, The Telltale Heart, and The Black Cat. And I also wanted to begin talking about writing papers. And you'll notice that after Edgar Allan Poe, we've got Jekyll and Hyde, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is classified as a novella. It's longer than a short story because we're reading short stories from Poe, but it won't be as long as a novel, which is something like what we are in the midst of now with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and will be with Dracula. So for those of you who wanted to start a little bit early, I was also able to find a link for Jekyll and Hyde in the event that you don't have access to a hard copy, and that's in the notes below. So, in terms of Frankenstein, we were talking about some of the ways that this text has become so iconic, and I just wanted to end with a few observations and a few quotations. And that at the very beginning of the text, we have the establishment of setting, that it takes place in December. That is going to be so important, again, when you think about the Gothic tradition. Winter is supposed to represent descent. This also happens to be the story of birth and rebirth, if you want to think about the creature in that perspective. So it seems that also is appropriate for setting this story in December. You might have noticed that we oftentimes are presented with extremes of cold and hot, fire and ice. And this text is very much also an examination of what happens with extremes. We see this with Victor, but we first see this with Walton. And the importance of Walton to the narrative can't be underestimated, because ultimately, if there's going to be any kind of happy ending here, it's certainly not going to be through Victor's story or through the creature story. It's going to be through the possibility that Walton has learned, and on a further note, that we ourselves as readers have learned from this tale. Of course, we talked about the epistolary novel and the fact that Walton is our sole narrator, which leads to complications with the reliability of the text. But regardless of how we want to think about the reliability of the text, we know that Walton very clearly stated that he preferred glory. And that's hubris, basically. And hubris is punished. And we will see that and from a moral perspective in many Gothic texts. We are told a little bit about Victor Frankenstein's story and how Victor Frankenstein reflects on his childhood, saying, I was my parents' plaything and their idol, and something better, their child, the innocent and helpless creature bestowed on them by heaven. And of course, I can't help but note the irony, this is in the first chapter, that Victor had such a good childhood, but yet is not able to provide the creature with one. And also the idea of a child being viewed as a plaything, as a possession, which is something that Victor does carry forth with him when he creates the creature. And as some of you observed, when Victor talks in chapter 3 about the loss of his mother, it would seem that his mother's death is a main impetus for Victor's desire to try to create life from death. It also is reminiscent of the play Dr. Faustus, which I had referenced earlier, about a scholar with unlimited knowledge, a play that was written during Shakespeare's time, the Renaissance. And the scholar makes a deal with the devil in order to be able to get unlimited knowledge and is punished accordingly. But one of the things that Faustus discusses in Dr. Faustus is that he hopes to use this knowledge for good, for instance, to help men live eternally. And again, he doesn't come anywhere near to his ambitions. In fact, he squanders the very little knowledge that he is given. But at any rate, continuing on, one of the things that I think is quite clever of Shelley is that she doesn't give too many details about the creation of the creature. And we're even told in the text that Victor isn't going to be able to give details because he doesn't want someone to duplicate his experiments. But I think it also makes Shelley's text so timeless because we can't have future science reject or negate some of her possibilities. Something that we will have a different response to when we get to Dracula with some questionable science there. And one of the ways that I think that also maybe Shelley dropped the ball, so to speak, so she isn't always smooth in her writing, is when she talks about, or Victor, I should say, talks about creating the creature, and as to the minuteness of the parts, it formed a great hindrance to my speed. So I resolved, contrary to my first intention, to make the being of a gigantic stature. Or we can say, in addition, that perhaps this is quite clever from Shelley's perspective, because if you think about technology, it usually begins from a bigger perspective and then becomes smaller and smaller. And this text could be just as easily viewed as a commentary on technology as it could be viewed as a commentary on some of the isms in our society, such as racism and classism, judging by appearance and making that which is outside of ourselves other or alien or monstrous. So we continue on with the text, and we know, of course, about Justine, who is framed by the creature for Victor's brother's murder. And Justine confesses and admits, I confessed a lie. I confessed that I might obtain absolution, but now that falsehood lies heavier at my heart than as any other sin. My confessor besieged me, he threatened me, he menaced me, until I almost began to think that I was the monster that he said I was. And he threatened excommunication and hellfire in my last moments. And I had talked about the power of religion during this time period, especially for female, and the expectation that female be pious. So this was enough to persuade Justine, someone who was innocent, to admit to a crime that she didn't commit. And then it's Victor who shortly thereafter says that he feels like both William and William and Justine were the first hapless victims of Victor's unhallowed arts. And I'd say that, yes, not only are they the victims, but the true first victim would be the creature itself, who first is created unnaturally, and then secondly is, and more importantly from my perspective, is abandoned by Victor. And we know that Victor at this point, tries to rationalize what he has done, while eventually we get the creature's perspective, talking about how ultimately the creature was able to teach itself language through observing a family, the DeLacy family. And it's a long, complicated story, the DeLacy family, and why they are in a hovel so that ultimately the creature can observe them, something that we usually don't see in the Hollywood adaptations. But this is in chapter 14 where we learn that the father of Safie had been the cause of the DeLacy family ruin, that the father was a Turkish merchant and had inhabited Paris for many years, when for some reasons that basically were unclear, he became obnoxious to the government. So he was seized and cast into prison, and this was the very day that Safie arrived from Constantinople to join him. The father was tried and condemned to death. The injustice of the sentence was so flagrant that Felix of the DeLacy family felt that he had to intervene. He had accidentally been present at the trial, Felix that is, and Felix's horror and indignation were uncontrollable when he heard the decision of the courts. So Felix made a solemn vow to deliver Safie's father, and then looked around for a means. And then ultimately Safie's father, to try to encourage Felix's involvement, offered his daughter like a piece of property, Safie, and Felix was immediately smitten with Safie. Luckily, Safie was also immediately smitten with him. But we find out from the creature that he found out all of this during his residence in the hovel, where he was able to find letters that were often in the hands of Felix or Agatha. And notice how often letter writing is the way in which we are given information in this particular story. And then Safie, as I mentioned last class, related that her mother was a Christian Arab and seized and made a slave by the Turks. And recommended by her beauty, she won the heart of the father of Safie, who married her. The young girl spoke in high and enthusiastic terms of her mother, who, born in freedom, spurned the bondage to which she was now reduced. She instructed her daughter in the tenets of her religion and taught her to aspire to the higher powers of intellect and independence of spirit forbidden to the female followers of Muhammad. This lady died, and notice how often we've got motherless individuals in this text. But her lessons were impressed on the mind of Safie, who sickened at the prospect of again returning to Asia and being immured within the walls of a harem, allowed only to occupy herself with infantile amusements, ill-suited to the temper of her soul, now accustomed to a grand idea and a noble emulation for virtue. The prospect of marrying a Christian and remaining in a country where women were allowed to take a rank in society were enchanting to her. And I had also mentioned that this is part of Mary Shelley's European bias. But Safie's father, even though he was allowing the intimacy between Felix and Safie, in his heart, he had formed other plans. He loathed the idea that his daughter should be united to a Christian, but he feared the resentment of Felix if he should appear lukewarm, for he knew he was still in the power of his deliverer. And this idea of who has power and who doesn't is something that we will see throughout the text as well. And it turns out that Safie, through some papers of her father, which fell into her hands, heard of the exile of her lover, and because basically Safie's father had the de Lacy family imprisoned under false charges, and then ultimately they were exiled. And this was the way that he was going to protect his daughter from a union with Felix. But the daughter finds some papers that the father had and was able to find where Felix was. And of course, we are given more information through letters, which is the pretty characteristic way that an epistolary novel goes about giving its tale. So, as we continue on, I wanted to draw your attention to the creature and confronting his maker, saying, "Accursed creator, why did you form a monster so hideous that even you turned from me in disgust?" This is in chapter 15. And then the creature's resolution is that Victor has a responsibility to at least provide the creature with companionship. So the creature asks for a mate, which I think is quite interesting. Certainly we have sympathy, even empathy for the creature. And certainly we can see parallels with Adam and Eve. And the story of Paradise Lost is a story that's often referenced in Frankenstein. However, it does also strike me that the creature wants a female created purely for its own benefit, and that this is also yet another way of Shelley making commentary about the idea of how female is viewed as possession in society. No one ever asks the female creation if she wants to be created. The assumption is that she should be created not just for the sake of creation, but for the benefit of the male creature. That's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, if you're curious, which would be due on Friday. That would be the 30th of September at 8 a.m. And again, if you need an extension, please let me know. And as I had indicated, I don't expect you to respond to your classmates, but I do expect you to read their responses and my responses in turn. And then certainly if you wanted to respond to either me or to your classmates, please do so the way you would do in a live class. And by reading all of that, you would get a sense of the class discussion that would follow after these video presentations. My question is, do you think Victor should have created a female for the creature? Why or why not? Do you think Victor should have created a female? Why or why not? Again, no necessarily right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your reasoning than in anything else. And we know that Victor attempts to create a female and then decides that it's too risky, rationalizing that if he were to create a female, then humankind would be endangered because he assumes that the female, along with the male creature, would wreak havoc onto humanity. He's also afraid that they would breed. Again, I and others have noted that if Victor is able to create life from death, he probably is able to create a female that is infertile. But despite some of the flaws in the writing, my favorite being that a satchel of books just happens to be available in the middle of the wilderness for the creature to find, I doubt that anybody could have been able to create such an iconic text, let alone someone at the tender age of 19, which is what Mary Shelley was. And then finally, what we end up seeing is that when Victor denies the creature is mate, the creature is going to get its revenge by denying Victor his mate. So that is the justification for killing Elizabeth. Not that there ever is a justification for killing. And also any other element in Victor's life that provides Victor with companionship. And Clerval is certainly important in that respect. So what we get is the kind of cat and mouse chase scene at the very end, where it seems that both Victor and the creature need each other in order to survive. Without one, the other has no reason to live. And both are bent on revenge upon the other. And you can see the parallels perhaps with father and son, with Victor and the creature. Might be an interesting thing to talk about perhaps in a journal. But there are lots of things that you can talk about in a journal, because our first journal will be due today, if you're watching this video, on the 25th, which is Wednesday, at 11:59 p.m. or earlier, via PDF, please. That's how my grading program works best. To my email, Ruiz, R-U-I-Z, @gcc.mass.edu. I know some of you have already submitted in your journal. Thank you very much. And what I will be doing is evaluating those informally on a checkmark system. I think of it as a conversation on paper, and I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics. In fact, you don't even necessarily have to write in complete sentences. You could do bullet points if you wanted to. But it would be as if we were having an oral exchange, but instead we're doing it on paper. I know we've done some of this on the discussion forum, but this is a way that you can do it privately with me and not necessarily have it be available for your peers to read. So this is a great place for questions and observations as well. And get that back to you. And this is how the rest of the semester will basically go, that at the ending of each major Gothic author, you'll have an informal journal response. So as we move forward, our next author is going to be Edgar Allan Poe, very famous Gothic writer, and I suspect you probably have read a little bit of Edgar Allan Poe. Perhaps you've even read some of the short stories that I have assigned. The Black Cat, for instance, is oftentimes a favorite in high schools, and even junior high schools. I think that's when I was first introduced to the Black Cat, and when I was in junior high school. But we'll talk a little bit about the conventions of what a short story is, and we will also talk a little bit about all four of these stories, the most complex probably being The Fall of the House of Usher. It's also the longer one. And we'll talk a little bit more about Lovecraft, because remember, from Lovecraft's perspective, Poe was perhaps the greatest Gothic writer because of Poe's ability to use realism and psychology in his texts, as well as hint at supernatural. Not that all of Poe's stories do that, but as I think I might have mentioned, Poe was the creator of the modern day mystery story. So Murders in the Rue Morgue, for instance. But I deliberately selected stories that had Gothic elements within them, not just mysterious elements within them. And probably Poe's most famous work is not even a short story. It happens to be a poem, The Raven. But you can see that even in his short stories, he has many poetic elements associated with them. And again, I said I wanted to talk about in the next couple classes writing papers and how to go about writing a formal academic analysis. So we'll discuss that as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Edgar Allan Poe. Take care. Bye-bye.